Hi, everyone who's joined. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes and let folks trickle in. Welcome. For folks just joining, we're giving it one more minute. Welcome, everyone. Okay, I think we are ready to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here for, I think, what is our very first nominations Golden Goose Awareness Briefing. I'm Erin Heath. I am Director of Federal Relations for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Golden Goose Award Steering Committee, and we're glad you're all here. I'm going to now turn it to my co-chair, Meredith Asbury, to talk about what you're in store for.
Yes, thanks, Erin. So if we could go to the next slide. Just to give you a brief outline of what we plan to cover in the next hour. We know some individuals may be joining us that are not as familiar with the Golden Goose Award, so we'll explain what the award is, what we seek to award, our connection to Congress. We'll also walk through the nominations process and the criteria we use to evaluate nominations, give you a sense of some of our previous awardees and their connections to federal research agencies, and then wrap up with mention of our awards ceremony and leave time at the end for questions. So with that, I will turn it back over to Erin.
All right, thanks, Meredith. So what the Golden Goose Award is, essentially, is an award that honors federally funded research that has a major and yet unexpected impact on society. And the way this award started is when a congressman, Jim Cooper of Tennessee, came up with an idea. He watched a senator named Bill Proxmire give out awards in the 70s and 80s called the Golden Fleece Award that targeted what he considered to be wasteful government spending. And every once in a while, that award would target scientific research. And Jim Cooper wanted to really turn this story on its head into a positive story about science that goes in unexpected and exciting directions. And luckily for us, there are all sorts of examples, wonderful examples of science that goes in exciting and unexpected directions. So back in 2012, 9 founding organizations got together and we gave out the first 3 awards, and we've been doing it annually ever since. And the award has really grown over that time. So to give you a flavor of what a Golden Goose Award is like, we're going to go to the next slide and show you a 5-minute video of one of our past awardees.
peanut butter. So this will be the fun part of today.
Unless you've seen a hardwood plywood panel, you probably wouldn't recognize one. What you do recognize, though, are cabinet doors, the sides of cabinets, the sides of furniture. All that is quite often hardwood plywood, just converted into a finished good.
Formaldehyde was becoming a bigger and bigger issue. It was just showing up in more studies, more cancer studies. This was presented as a solution that could replace all of the formaldehyde-based adhesives in our company.
So you look at all this, they just stick there. So show me. I don't think I can get this one up. A friend of mine said, let me show you the Bay Area. There's lots of mussel. You drove down here and show me this place. As you can see, all the mussels stick together. Really thick layer of the mussels stick together. As a chemist, I always say, this is amazing. How can they develop something that can stick to the dirty, wet surface? So I went back to check the literature. They figured, somebody already done the research and said, oh, they figured out this mussel produce a protein, had this unique, a unique amino acid composition. How can I utilize this extraordinary ability to develop adhesive? Then one day I was eating lunch. I suddenly realized that soy meal has about 50% protein. Now protein is protein. They all consist of amino acid, but it has different composition. So at that time I thought, can I convert the soy protein into excellent adhesive this way? That's how we got started. That's how we got the funding from the USDA. It was a long process. We published more than 30 papers. We found that use the Western agent, just mix it with soil and water. And during making the plywood, it make the adhesive very water resistant. I gave a presentation and I basically described this novel adhesive system.
And after the presentation, I couldn't help but think he was talking directly to us, directly to our company, because this is what we'd been looking for years. So we struck up a conversation immediately after that meeting. And before we left that conference, we had already settled on an agreement to pursue commercialization with it. We worked in the lab for a while just to get an understanding of what we think it's going to take it to one of our factories and try it. We had built a portable mixing system, and that went on for probably 3-4 months. And we went to the factory the first time, and it was a disaster. Nothing.
We estimate that over 60% of all plywood made in America uses a soy-based resin as its bonding agent.
It had so many benefits that were beyond just the product. We could provide a better work environment for the employees, a better community environment around our mills, and provide our customers with a product that's healthier as well.
I enjoy what I did, so I enjoy working. But I never thought it has such a big impact.
The impact is really, really big from this kind of work, and those federal dollars come in and they provide the seed money and actually let it grow more and more and more to be something where then everyone says, boy, we needed that and we didn't even know it could exist.
All right, so if you want to read more Golden Goose Award stories, they are on our website at goldengooseaward.org, and there are many, many videos like that there as well. So I encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. So as you can see, and as you know, the award was started by a member of Congress, and since its inception, it's enjoyed bipartisan, bicameral support. So members of Congress, they come to our ceremony every year to talk about the benefits of federal support of science. They've also talked about it on the House floor, in congressional hearings, in the media, and with their own constituents. We informally call them the gaggle, and we're very happy to have them in our corner. Next slide.
All right. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the nominations process for the award. So nominations can be submitted at any time through the link that's listed here to our website. Our typical award cycle usually commences on the heels of the last award cycle, which is capped off by our annual award ceremony, which we just held last month. So from October to December, that is really when we're pushing to collect nominations for the next award cycle. Our deadline for consideration for the 2024 award cycle is December 15th of this year, so Friday, December 15th. In January, after that nomination deadline passes, our selection committee will review the submitted nominations and evaluate them looking at 3 criteria: the quality of the science, the impact of the science, and the quality of the story. And I'll explain those a bit in a few more moments. But we should also emphasize that in addition to those 3 criteria, in order for any nomination to advance, it must have a clear federal funding connection. That is the lens in which we look at all of our nominations. And of course, we often see a mix of funding sources related to a project, but ultimately the federal funding component is why we tell these stories. And so that's an important part of a nomination that gets submitted. We do select 3 stories to award each year. It's important to note that nominations can be for individuals or for a team of researchers. And the nominees don't all have to be from one organization or an institution to be nominated. We often see a mix of research collaborations across institutions or academic and industry partnerships. And so you'll notice we also don't set a limit on the number of individuals that can be nominated as part of a story. That being said, there is often a natural limitation to how many people you can nominate and still tell a good story, because ultimately that's our goal, is to tell a compelling, easy to understand story. And so typically we find that if there's more than, say, about 5 nominees, we may need to do some refocusing to really narrow to what we're ultimately trying to communicate. We do not accept self-nominations, but organizations or individuals are not limited in the number of nominations that can be submitted. We also have seen individuals group together and submit multiple nominations in support of the same story. And while that does not increase your chances of being selected, or for a story to be selected, it is a good way to get across multiple different perspectives of a nomination and what we could actually ultimately use to evaluate and to tell that story in a complete way. So here, looking at the nomination criteria, there's 4 nomination questions that we ask on our nomination form. And so I'll go through them and kind of what we look for each. But overall, these questions align with the criteria in which our committee evaluates the nominations on. And so we've also put together a helpful document that kind of outlines some helpful tips to submitting a nomination, and we will circulate that after today's webinar. So I'm going to walk through the questions now. So to start with the first question, describe the specific nature of the research conducted by the nominated individual or individuals, including the specific federal agencies that supported their work. When completing this section, it is helpful to introduce those that are involved in the research, establish a time frame inclusive of their initial work, the discovery, how long it took, context for the timing if that's relevant. You could also highlight here the scientific process. Where did something go wrong, or what was Was there something that was unexpected in their research? If something went wrong, was it disappointing, or did it lead to a new pathway? We also see nominations include here information on if there are unique qualities about a researcher themselves. Perhaps they're, a very well-known mentor in their field. That is also something that we like to talk about in our stories. There may also be, we've had examples of stories in the past where individuals may struggle to actually get their idea funded. And so that's also something that could be elaborated on under this question. Looking at the second question here is on the Golden Goose Award recognizes silly sounding, serendipitous, and surprising research that has contributed to society. Explain how research appeared unusual, obscure, sounded funny, and or could be viewed as having questionable value at the time it was originally funded. When completing this section, we're looking for information like, is there a sense that the research is unusual, obscure, or sounds funny in some way? Being detailed on what that means to you or to the researcher can help provide context as we're reviewing the nominations. Other things that could be included here are, was an idea initially ridiculed or went against a general understanding about a research field, or something others believed could never work. Another way to think about it is if there's a sense that the project did not have a clear societal impact at the outset, those are all useful points that can be pointed out. We'll go to the next slide. The third box on the form asks you to explain the results of the particular research were unexpected, unforeseen, and or serendipitous in nature. The question may seem similar to the second question that we just answered, but what's covered here is a little bit different in that we're looking for a little bit more detail on the results of the research, as opposed to the last question, which is really more focused on the initial or early work. So in this section, there may be an element of serendipity or surprise by a result. Other questions to consider are, did the researchers expect their work to lead to a certain understanding or discovery? And is that what ultimately happened? Perhaps the research followed along a pretty straightforward path, but the impact or the eventual use of that research was unexpected. And so those are all the good things to put forth here. And finally, the fourth question on the form is to describe the economic and societal and or transformational scientific impact of the research. And so answering the questions on how did this research make a difference, how was the impact measured, are all important things to identify. And then the final section on the form is to provide additional resources. This can be links to publications, funding award information, news articles, video links, or any materials that kind of help us validate the research work and the nomination story itself. So that was a very quick but detailed kind of summary of what we look for in submissions. And as I mentioned, we will circulate after the webinar a document that summarizes some of those helpful tips and questions to consider when submitting a nomination. And of course, happy to take questions during the Q&A more about what we're looking for or specifics of the nomination form. So with that, I will turn it back to Erin for the next slide.
All right, so to give you a sense of both the range and the impact of Golden Goose Awards, here are some awardees who have also received Nobel Prizes either before or after receiving a Golden Goose Award. We've got Charles Towns, who invented laser technology. We have the team who worked on green fluorescent protein that revolutionized biomedical imaging. We have an economics award involving matching organ donors and other market design applications. We have an award on game theory and auctions that informed how to allocate the nation's telecommunications spectrum. We have pioneers in visual processing and innovators behind bladeless LASIK eye surgery. And next click, most recently, Catalin Carrico and Drew Wiseman for their work on mRNA, which is relevant to the vaccines we all know and love today. Next slide. Oh, one more thing before I turn it back to Meredith. I want to add, while we do have a lot of prize winners, we also have had the privilege of telling stories that haven't been told before, which is extremely rewarding as well.
Thanks, Erin. And as we mentioned earlier, what makes the Golden Goose Award different from perhaps other awards is the emphasis on federal research funding to support discoveries. And so probably to no surprise, we see here that NIH and NSF are often the most common supporters of awardees' work. That is where a lot of basic research is funded from, including the DoD. So, but that being said, we'd love to add even more federal funding connections, and there's no limit on where stories can come from, and we welcome nominations that allow us to tell a variety of stories and their connections to various federal research funding sources. Next slide.
All right, so this year in 2023, we had 5 wonderful awardees. We had the Nanopore team, a group whose work dramatically advanced DNA sequencing, and it all started with a notebook sketch on the side of the road. We have Mary Dale Chilton, who figured out how to use millions of years old bacteria to genetically modify plants. And we have Paul Siegel, who has a study that's been running for 65 years and counting. It's been foundational to what we know about chickens today. And these studies collectively were funded by the US Department of Agriculture, National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and NASA. So you can see there's a wide range of federal funding agencies involved. So before I turn back to Meredith, I want to just say that if you have questions, now is a good time to start dropping those questions into the Q&A box, and we will start to take them in a few minutes. Meredith, back to you.
So Golden Goose stories have been highlighted through a variety of mediums over the years, which is great to see because we want to see the awards stories and the stories of our awardees shared far and wide. And that only helps us spread the message on the importance of federal funding for research. And so some recent examples here, Golden Goose awardees were featured in 2 podcasts within the last year. The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe has a science or fiction segment, which used last year's awardees, and Radiolab dubbed the award the Grammys of government-funded research, which we are humbled and honored to have that title. And they interviewed some of the awardees from last year and put together a really great story, which if you haven't listened to, we would encourage you to check it out. We will be continuing to work with Radiolab to hopefully produce another podcast on this year's most recent awardees. And we're hoping to make that an annual media component of our storytelling in the future. The GGI stories over the years have also been featured in places like CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a variety of trade publications. So really getting the word out on the science and the discoveries and the serendipitous nature of the stories that we're trying to tell, which leads us to the next slide, which we have a trivia question, and perhaps some of you know this, but maybe some of you don't. So a fun little trivia question on the question, what popular game show was the Golden Goose Award featured? So I'll give you a moment to submit your answer, which it does seem most of us do know the answer. All right. Great. Well, I think we can close the poll and move on to reveal the answer, which is, without anticipation, Jeopardy. Golden Goose was featured in a Clue that aired on Christmas Day in 2019. It was quite an exciting moment to be highlighted, and not to inflate our egos, but perhaps gave us some sense of accomplishment that the word about Golden Goose Award is actually getting out there when you make it into a nationally syndicated show. So with that very, very exciting trivia piece, I'll turn it back to Erin.
All right, so the last thing that we want to say to you all is we would love for you to join us next year at our annual award ceremony. It's held every September on Capitol Hill, and we welcome folks to come either in person or we have a live stream every year, and we would welcome folks who have been there every year or folks who are there for the first time. So stay tuned to our website and to social media for more information about that as we get closer. All right, I think now it is time for Q&A.
Great. Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful presentation. My name is Gwendolyn Bogart. I work with Erin at the AAAS and with both of Meredith and Erin at the Golden Goose Award. I'm popping on to read a couple questions. I'll start with kind of a general one. I think the idea of having an award that is you know, focused on federal research, federal you know, a broader idea of how the science is important. We are on a cycle, and obviously Congress is on a cycle. We're starting to think about, like the nominations this year, when are we starting to like accept nominations? What does it look like in terms of do folks need to consider like congressional terms, appropriations, anything like that when they're thinking about like nominations timing?
You want to take that one?
Go right ahead, Erin.
Okay. All right. So so first of all, you can submit a nomination really anytime. We take them year round, but that said, we really start to gear up to collect them in the fall. So right after the ceremony, then we move into what I consider to be prime nominations season. So that's right now. So this is a perfect time to get those stories. And as I think Meredith mentioned, the deadline that we have set for ourselves is December 15th. And so if you want a nomination to really be considered for the next cycle, I would try to get it in by December 15th. And awesome. And so yeah, again, really, I think personally, like any time of year is a great time for a Golden Goose nomination, but if you're thinking about doing it, now is an especially good time.
Awesome.
I'll just add on to that, you know, we will award 3 stories per year, which isn't a lot. But that can sometimes mean that we have more approved stories that come out of the selection committee process than we're able to award in a year. And so sometimes there's questions about what happens to those nominations after they're approved. Are they just kind of sitting around? So because a nomination is submitted and approved, it doesn't necessarily mean the nomination is discarded if it's not awarded that year. We'll kind of hold on to those approved nominations, and we'll try to work it into our other awards in subsequent years. We also try and balance for several factors like just the types of awardees, the variety of federal funding, and really balance to make sure that we're showing a representative picture of a variety of things that can happen. A variety of federal funded stories that we can tell, and individuals as well. So they don't expire, but to kind of tack on to that point, if you nominate a story and then maybe a year or so later, there's more information that is relevant to a particular nomination, you can certainly resubmit it and provide that additional information because sometimes, you know, more impact comes as time goes on, and that would be helpful for us to know.
Yeah, thank you both. We have a few more questions, specifically about a new novel and unexpected DNA sequencing method has dramatically improved forensics for unsolved murder victim identification. The submitter is not sure if there was funding for the original research, but the FBI has supported most of the analyses. Would that qualify?
I think it certainly could qualify. I would not rule it out at all at this point. I would definitely love to see this nomination and would encourage you to submit it. And feel free, if you wanted to talk about the specific details of it, to get in touch with one of us. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, awesome. How many of the 80 Golden Goose Award recipients were also inventors and had patents? What about that side of things?
I'm not sure that's a figure that we've, or a characteristic that we've tracked regularly, though it's a good point that we should be looking into that more. But to give one example, so this past year, the nanopore sequencing team that was awarded, there were several patents involved with that technology that ultimately Oxford Nanopore ended up commercializing. So there are definitely examples of these stories. That's the most recent one that comes to mind. But it's something that we should look into tracking and keeping better record of.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we often will refer to patents and inventions as an example of the impact, because that's that like translational aspect that we often see from basic research getting into application. Cool, thank you. How about if someone is aware of research and interesting technology that has had an impact, but isn't necessarily aware of all of the contributors to that, if they like have maybe a couple identified but aren't sure of all of them, can the Golden Goose team help identify the other contributors?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the research process really comes into play. You know, the nomination is really just the first step in the storytelling process. The nomination is what makes us aware of the story to begin with most of the time. But then there's a whole long research process that we undertake for every nomination that advances. And sometimes we have, going through that process, added folks to the award if it comes out that really this person had a really critical role in this research and they should be part of it. And so it really just comes down to talking to the nominators, eventually talking to the nominees themselves, and really honing in on the story that we want to tell.
Yeah, thank you. How about, can you talk a little more broadly about the selection process? Who are we writing to on the selection committee? How do they review applications?
Yeah, so I can take that one. Our selection committee is comprised of science experts and science communicators. And so they meet in January to we pull together all the nominations that are submitted and we format them for them. And then they, based on the criteria, which I outlined earlier, the quality of the science, the impact of the science, and the quality of the story, they're looking for different things. And they rank them based off of that. So, and then we collect that information and we kind of determine with the selection committee, what are the type of stories, looking at what's submitted and what we, sometimes there's examples where we kind of brought this up where we don't know. There might be more to a nomination that wasn't submitted. And so there might be more work that we need to do behind the scenes to get a nomination through and advanced. And so the selection committee process is kind of the starting point, but it certainly doesn't see us through to the end. They kind of help us vet those stories and identify what perhaps we should be looking more at if a nomination may be incomplete. So after the nomination or the selection committee reviews the nominations, it's this team here that kind of goes through and does some additional research to look into stories that the story may not be fully formed yet. Anything to add to that, Erin?
Yeah, I think so. It's sort of jumping off from that a little bit. You know, uh, some of the common holes in nominations that we see that we might feel like we need to do more research on our, you know, at Golden Goose, we're trying to tell the stories of the science. And so the nominations that help us tell those stories are often the most appealing and the ones that we have the most to jump off from. So, you know, on that note, telling that story in a way that appeals especially to non-scientific audiences, because a lot of the members of our audience are non-scientists. That means avoiding jargon and all of the other tips that you get in Science Communication 101. And the other common challenge with nominations sometimes is sometimes we get really interesting nominations where the impact is not quite developed enough yet. It's just too early to tell, or it looks like it's going in a direction, but it hasn't actually gone there yet. And those are really interesting, and they're ones that we keep an eye on, but it's usually too early to give an award for those. So as Meredith already said before, that's where, you know, if there is an award that was submitted, say 5 years ago, and there have been some new developments, then we definitely encourage resubmission of those.
Yeah, certainly. I think, that's a wonderful thing to point out, because it is a fluid kind of process that we are keeping an eye on things as they develop. I guess kind of jumping off of that, then as folks consider ideas to potentially submit, I know we have kind of a formalized nomination form. If folks don't have a potential idea that's maybe not fully formed, or if they don't have like the capacity to fill out the nomination form at like a certain moment, what would you suggest? Are there ways to kind of still potentially lift up an idea that could potentially become a nomination?
Absolutely. So I think Erin said this earlier, but the nomination is really kind of helping us become aware of an idea or a research story. And so coming directly to us, if you don't feel like you have enough information to fill out a nomination form, you can always reach out to us. We are a resource, willing to be a sounding board. I mean, we have a pretty good sense of the type of stories that get submitted and what we're looking for, and how we tell those stories ultimately, and how they're, you know, how we tell the award story. So you can always reach out to us and bounce ideas off of us, and we can give you ideas about what may be useful to include, depending on the story. Sometimes just help identifying the right nominator. You know, in the past, I think we've seen a wide range of nominators. It can be institutions, it could be the vice president for research, it could be the head of a company. I mean, or professors, you know, individuals, faculty themselves. So we see quite a wide range. But sometimes people don't feel that they have the technical expertise or know enough about the science in order to submit a nomination. And so we can kind of talk through that and work through it. But we're happy to be a resource in those cases.
Yeah, definitely. A very kind comment, not a question. That Mark Akeson, who we adore, who is an awardee of this year, says that he thinks there are many pivotal experiments that fit this set of criteria. And thanks for organizing this. And we agree. There's so much good work going on out there, and it's exciting to have to connect with folks who are on the ground, who have connections to the awesome federally funded research that's happening out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, any kind of final comments? I think we've kind of covered a bunch of different, aspects of the nomination process.
Yeah, I would love to just add one more thing, which is, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And it's nice to hear from you, Mark. I want to say that we're always looking for new stories to tell. We're looking for diverse nominees. We're looking for nominees from a range of scientific disciplines, and we're looking for the stories that have yet to be told or told in a new way. So we would love for all of you to help us by sharing the information about nominations far and wide. And we would love to hear from you with new stories to tell.
Yeah, likewise, nothing to add to that. So not seeing any other questions come through. We're a little short of the hour, but we've gotten through everything that we wanted to communicate, which just means that we're efficient communicators. So with that, thank you for joining us. And we have recorded this webinar and it will be posted on our website. And we'll be sure to send around some helpful tips and questions to consider when submitting a nomination. But thank you for being here today. And with that, the webinar is concluded.